Did you see it?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
How are you this evening?
I have a question actually for you, Professor.
Okay.
Cooper. So
Okay.
I have like documents, but I don't really, I know like when we're citing things, we need like a title. So like, say I have like a letter or like a kind of chart of like weapons and like a list of people and like what
Mm-hmm.
and like there's no really like a formal like title. I just got these papers from the historical society. So how
Okay.
would I cite that almost? I'm just kind of asking.
Okay. Well, that's a very good question. Let's just see 1 second, and I will answer it because this is you usually, well, you always start with the document, the author of the document. That's the most important thing. Um, so you would have, so let's just start with one of the documents. So a letter,
Yeah, I have a letter, and then that would have like a the person. But what
the
about
first,
for like something like a chart that
a
doesn't have
chart. Well,
a
in
bunch
that,
of names on it?
does it have a title?
No, it doesn't. It's just like
And so, what's it about? What's
it's
um,
about like weapons and like how many weapons each person had in my
okay.
town.
Well, in that case, what you're going to want to do is describe it as best you can shortly. Um, Let me just see if there is a way I can show you this so it makes sense. Let me see if I can open this and find a new document. Here we go. Okay, so something, does it have any other information on it? Is there a date on
Yeah, there would be a date on it. Yes.
it? Is there any, do you know who made the chart?
No, that's my problem. That
Okay, okay.
yeah.
So, um, so I would do something like this. Okay, chart, and it shows weapons.
Like the names of different weapons and like at the top, and then the people on the side, and it's like kind of graphed out how
Where, okay. Um, let's say weapons. Usually, where did you find it, Megan?
the historical society. She just had a few papers and
Okay, which historical society?
Weymouth Historical Society.
Okay,
It's a private one
yeah,
though.
okay. So, um, and who are the people who are listed?
I don't have it with me. I just wanted to ask like a general question about it.
Okay,
I should
so,
have grabbed it, but
okay,
it's
and then
a
so
bunch of
you,
people.
there is a date on it, you said.
Yes.
Like, what do you know the date offhand?
I don't know it offhand. I
Is it
just
like 1770s or like 2000s or is it?
1770s
Okay,
definitely.
okay. Then you would put the date. Um, and then you would put, usually the Historical Society often will have it as part of a collection or a certain folder number or something like that. If you have any information like that.
I could probably contact them, but it was just very informal. Like I just went to the historical
Okay.
society and she
And she
pulled
said, here's the 1770s document that you can take home and,
I she scanned them for me.
okay, okay, yeah, okay. So, date, and then you would put, whatever, if there is a collection name, you would have it here and then folder, whatever. The main thing you want to do is make sure someone else can find it if they want to check it. Then you put
Okay.
Weymouth Historical Society,
Just give credit to the society
yeah,
basically.
something like that. I
Okay.
mean, so that's essentially it for any kind of a primary source. You want to have the document and you want to have whatever kind of identifying information there might be on the document and then wherever you found.
Thank you. I just didn't want to like think you I'm you to think that I just made this paper up like because
Yeah,
I
no,
have
that's exactly why you do this. So anyone else can check it. In fact, there was a well-known historian about 20 years ago who wrote this big book about, well, he had kind of a political argument he was trying to make based on things that happened in the 1700s. And then people went to check his sources, and it turned out the sources he was citing didn't exist.
yeah.
So yeah, I think the book had been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize until it turned out that he was making it all up.
I
So
scan them and like put them with my paper. Would you prefer that? Like,
Yeah, you can do that just because it would be interesting, but yeah.
yeah,
You're just citing it, this is what you would do is show, what the document is. If it is a letter, so, you have, I think we already covered this, letters, the author's name,
thank you.
date, and then wherever you found it. Okay, so, yeah, you wouldn't just put, let's say, Weymouth Historical Society, because then I would have to retrace your steps or
Yeah.
whatever else. Okay. A very good question. So thank you for asking. Are there any other questions?
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've been on like a wild goose chase trying to find sources. Like I've emailed like 5 different archives. So like I was wondering, like, is it okay if part of my essay is talking about that process? Like I know you want.
If you had kind of an interesting process in doing this, yes. Because that's part of the whole process. It is a process you're going through. And so, yeah, I mean, some of you might have found the Rosetta Stone that is going to unlock all the secrets of the revolution based on what you found in a local historical society. Others of you have run into brick walls. So, yeah, definitely, if it's a wild goose chase, say that. Or if you found a very helpful librarian who is so delighted that finally someone is interested in their collection, then yeah, mention that. Okay.
And so like, if I'm doing that, I guess like, how do you want us to talk about our personal experiences without using like personal pronouns and stuff?
Well, sometimes you have to. If every other sentence begins with the word I, then you probably should rethink how you're approaching it. But don't get awkward like this writer found or this researcher found. You can say that the Canterbury Historical Society never answered my phone calls, or the librarian here slammed down the phone when she found it. You don't necessarily attack them, but yeah. Typically, and I'm glad you asked, because that is a good thing to keep in mind, trying to avoid first person pronouns. Okay, I think, was it Dylan or Jake first and then Lila?
Yeah, so this might be a really dumb question. I was having issues last week with my server. I really couldn't hear much was going on. It was coming in and out. I assume you talked about the upcoming project or something.
Yes.
So I've been looking for this, and it's October 30th, which I know you rearranged that date, but pretty much my question is what's going on. I'm just a little lost right now.
Okay, so we pushed it back to the 6th. Okay, the due date is the 6th. And it is to find primary sources in your town if you can, okay? Or on that list that I put on Blackboard of towns, town records, find something there, okay?
Okay, so is that we're still talking about that was the website thing, right?
That would have been the website thing. We kind of changed that assignment into a primary source assignment. Finding a primary source or primary sources from a community in Massachusetts.
Okay, all right, perfect. That's all I needed.
So the website thing is off. If you ran into a real brick wall and you can't think of anything, then yeah, you can evaluate a website. I'd rather have you find something that we don't already know. Okay.
Sorry, but I keep having my volume. It's like cutting in and out, but I got it now. Thank you.
Okay, good. Lila?
Hi, yeah. So I have a few like little questions that I'm just gonna like kind of throw out at once. 2 of them going off of what Ainsley said. I ran into a couple of like goose hunts pretty much. But what I'm wondering is since the people that I have talked to and that have answered me, they direct me to a lot of like letters, kind of like the first essay that we've already done.
Yeah.
So should I kind of do the same thing and like
That's
read
fine.
through?
Yes.
Okay. And then
Yeah.
also I was looking at like videos of people that were like going through, and I'm doing Arlington, and I found a lot of like grave sites and like stuff with a bunch of important figures. So do you think I could mention that in the essay?
Definitely.
Perfect.
Yes, a lot happened in Arlington, so yes.
Yeah. And then also how she was talking about like speaking in first person.
Mhm.
If I were to explain like my experience in just like one paragraph before getting into that, so I don't have to keep using like first person, do you think that would be fine? So it's not too repetitive?
It might be,
Like-
but then again, maybe it won't. I mean, there are ways of writing about yourself without writing about yourself.
Right.
And so that's kind of the trick, something you're learning as you do this.
So
And
if I were
you-
just like started off with how it like the like hunt for finding the resources and
Yeah.
stuff went, and then go into like what I found.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, anytime you write something, you're learning as you do it. So I'm not saying
Right.
there is a formula for this. And what I really don't like is when someone says, okay, so I had this assignment to do, I went to the Historical Society, I couldn't find anything, but then I found this. That is just writing about yourself.
Yeah.
Rather than, so what's going on in Arlington? I mean, you kind of had a story how you got there because initially you were going to do something else that may or may not be interesting, but we know a lot happened in Arlington. Okay.
Yeah.
We know that people in Arlington who care about history really are into it, and they think that Arlington is underrepresented since most of the fighting on April 19th happened there, and they get kind of sore. So they have that, and then you have all these historical sites there. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not I don't quite know how you're gonna put it together, but I think,
Yeah, because a lot of the documents that I did end up gaining access to were the ones that were already public. Because when I was reaching out to
okay,
people in Arlington, they ran into a problem with the staff still isn't really allowed to go into the libraries
yeah,
and stuff.
yeah.
So they just gave me like the public stuff. So I don't
okay,
have.
that's fine, that's fine.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
I mean, we recognize that, yeah, and by the way, this is a problem that people who are working on books, people who are getting PhDs are also running into, that a lot of the archives that ordinarily they would use are closed, okay? So you are fighting the same thing that a lot of other people are fighting, and you seem to be doing really well with it. Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions on this assignment?
So for
Yes,
me,
Jake.
I had a lot of trouble since like everybody else, the Historical Society is closed. They don't have any public articles. So I had to go to the library, and the only thing they had was a book, but it's not a primary source though, but it has like very detailed, like exact dates of what happened this time.
Okay.
And
When was it published?
it said 1976, I believe.
Okay, so it was published around the time of the bicentennial.
Yeah.
And
Well, this is the bicentennial thing.
and I'm guessing it includes primary stuff.
Yeah, it does. It has a lot of
Okay.
letters.
Because another thing that I found is things published around in 1976 at the time of the bicentennial, there was a big push to publish primary documents. A lot of towns did this as kind of their project. And also in the 19th century, the mode for historians when they were doing, say, the town history or a biography was to have a lot of letters and primary documents. So often you can find a 19th century book that has a lot of primary sources that are no longer available. Just as an example, I think it was Nathaniel Green's son wrote a biography of him that is mainly letters that he wrote. And similarly with Josiah Quincy. I mean, this was the mode in the 19th century, which historians no longer use, but it's really invaluable now. The 19th century histories, the local histories particularly, are usually filled with primary documents. Okay, so you hit a brick wall because the Historical Society is closed, but if you can find a history of the town, and often because they're in the 19th century, they have been digitized, and you can find them on Google Books, or a lot of libraries will have access to the document, to the book, not as a book, but as a thing. You can do that.
Yes.
Okay.
So the book I found, it's so in depth. It has like exact dates of what
Wow.
happened this time. So
What's
it
the book? What's it about, Jake?
well, it's about the whole history of Sharon, but I'm just focusing on the Revolutionary War and how they made cannons, and Edward Quincy and Richard Gridley.
Okay.
Kind of telling the story about that.
I am having trouble with my speaker. Let me see if I can fix it. Okay. Thank you, Ainsley. Is that better, by the way? Can you hear me now? Better? No?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay, thank you.
Meh, it's a little better.
A little better. Okay, thank you for being honest. Let me see. Okay, I'll try to speak up. Yes, no, that's still the same.
I hear you.
Ainsley's saying no, not really. No. No.
I mean, like I can understand you. It's just like
Well, it's
kind
really
of
not the same.
in and
Well,
You try
let me-
unplugging and plugging it back in.
okay. Any difference now? Any difference now?
Nah.
No. Well, let me just try to switch microphones then.
I can hear you pretty fine.
Wow, you're really loud too. It's
I can
really
hear
loud.
you as well.
Okay. How about now? Is that louder?
I'm not having any issues.
You're not having any issues?
Same. I can hear you fine on my end.
Okay, because you're really loud now on mine.
It might be because some of us have headphones in, so the microphone's a lot closer to our mouths, so it might be a little bit louder.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let me see. I have someone else entering the waiting room. Okay. Let's see. Other issues? Okay, good. Does anyone remember where we left off last time?
We were talking a little bit about like the end of the war, and I remember specifically you brought up the fact that Adams and Franklin did not get along very well in like Paris, I believe.
Yeah, they didn't. And nonetheless, anything else anyone remembers? That's a good starting off point. Okay. Let me see if I can share this. Okay. Well, I don't know why it does this. What do you see on the screen?
I see a picture of a map and a picture of Benjamin Franklin surrounded by 4 other gentlemen.
Good. It's interesting because that's not what you should be seeing, but let me see. Okay. So what we have here, this is a painting done by Benjamin West. West was born in Pennsylvania, and he goes to London to study as an artist, and he becomes the portrait painter to King George III. He's a member of the Academy in London and one of the leading artists in the English world, and he is commissioned to do this painting of the peace negotiations, and which happened in Paris. And he did very well with the American side, that you recognize Benjamin Franklin sitting there. And the man standing behind Benjamin Franklin is Henry Lawrence, who is from South Carolina. And Lawrence actually didn't capture. He was being held in the Tower of London, and then he was exchanged to Lord Cornwallis, and he comes over to Paris to join in with the negotiations. And seated to Franklin's left, and in front of Lawrence is Franklin's grandson, Temple Franklin, who was the secretary. And then, does anyone recognize the man sitting to Franklin's right?
Is that Adams?
That is John Adams. And in fact, you can see this painting at the Adams National Historical Site. It hangs in their library. And standing behind John Adams is John Jay, who had come to negotiate, try to get a treaty with the Spanish, failed at that, and so he comes to Paris. And Jay actually writes the treaty that they sign at the end of December of 1782. And you'll see on the right side of the canvas, it's blank, as that is where West was going to paint the British negotiators, but they didn't want to hang around Paris to have their portraits done. And maybe West thought he could catch up with them in London and do their portraits, but they never wanted to sit for this particular portrait for some reason. But all the three British negotiators were all chosen because they had some connection with Benjamin Franklin. Richard Oswald was one. Benjamin Vaughan, actually in 1779, so during the war, had published an edition of Franklin's writings. Now, Vaughan was born in Jamaica. His mother was from Boston, and he went to England for trade opportunities, and then he was a member of Parliament until he was dismissed for being too radical. And the third negotiator, a guy named David Hartley, who went to Paris as a special envoy, and he actually had known Franklin since before 1774. And Hartley had favored reconciliation with America. And in fact, he got involved with Franklin because they negotiated prisoner exchanges. So you have these negotiators in Paris after really 1781, or 1782. This is when the negotiations with Britain really begin, because before that, England isn't going to send anyone to negotiate with America. And a couple of things held up the negotiations. One was the fact that the British were not going to deal with representatives of the United States, because at this point, before the treaty, Britain didn't want to recognize the United States. So they said, okay, we can talk to Mr. Adams as a representative from Massachusetts, and Mr. Franklin as a representative from Pennsylvania, and Mr. Jay from New York, et cetera, but we can't deal with you as representing the United States. And Adams, who was quite obstinate about things, said, well, then we shouldn't negotiate at all unless you recognize us as representing the United States. And it's this kind of a logistical point that really holds things up. And Vergennes, the French foreign minister, says, look, the delegates from Great Britain are here representing the King of England, and his title also is King of France. It's kind of a nicety that we don't really need to think too much about. And Franklin also says, look, if in the treaty they're going to represent American independence, that's what you would worry about, not what they call us ahead of time. And so this is one of the problems. Another problem we had is this. Congress had told the negotiators, make sure you act in concert with our French allies. And what the Americans discovered pretty quickly is that our French allies had a different agenda than the Americans did. So one of these is this. This is generally the border the Americans thought they were going to negotiate with Great Britain, that is extending to the Mississippi River. And in fact, John Jay was asked by the Spanish foreign minister, a man named Aranda, to draw a line on the map showing where he thought the western boundary of the United States should be. And Jay pretty much drew this line from up in the headwaters of the Mississippi River, down the Mississippi to the 31st parallel, and then across to the Atlantic Ocean. And here, roughly here, going through the middle of the Great Lakes, and then actually continuing along the 45th parallel. And Aranda says, that's very interesting. And he and the French take the map and they say, well, we'll show you where we see your western border. Essentially from the Flint River here, sorry, okay. The Flint River north to the Kanawha River, Then from the Kanawha, you follow the Ohio River north, essentially to Lake Erie. So this is the border as the French and the Spanish still had. And Jay knew that the United States couldn't agree to that border. And then after saying this, the French make a concession and say, okay, instead of up that way, we'll give you to the Wabash. And there, maybe this is the Wabash here. Either case, the French and the Spanish were trying to prevent the Americans from occupying this Western territory. And that's not something the English might have objected to, but something the English would have objected to is the eastern border between what's now New England and Canada. And so Jay and the English worked out an agreement on the eastern border to be the St. John's River in Canada, or in between Maine and Canada, and then the British will support the Americans on their western border. So here, the Americans' allies, the French and the Spanish, are trying to cut the country in half, and the British are the ones who support the American claim to the western country. I should say at this time, it is 1782. The war is still going on between Britain, Spain, and France. In fact, the French and the Spanish have tried to invade England. And in fact, this is a painting from 1782, the Isle of Jersey, which is off of it's in one of the English Channel Islands. And the French invaded, and the British repelled this invasion of Jersey. And the following year, the Spanish tried to besiege Gibraltar. And this is the British repelling the Spanish attempts to take Gibraltar from them. And so you have the war, and also in the summer of 1782, the British and the French fleets fought in the Caribbean, the Battle of the Saints, and the British won there. So the war hadn't been going as well for the Spanish and the French after the end of the war. So this is one of the problems, the western boundary. Two other problems in the negotiations. Let me just go back to sharing the screen.
Professor Allison,
Yes.
sorry for interrupting, but a lot of people are saying in the chat now that your mic has gotten worse.
Yeah.
I don't. Maybe can you unplug your earbuds and see if that does anything? Maybe.
I can't hear anything if I don't have them on, but I guess that's okay. Does that make any difference?
Not really.
Let me just go to my computer microphone. Hold on 1 second. Does that make any difference? I can't see you. Does that make any difference? No?
It just sounds like really quiet and like staticky a little bit.
My apologies. How about now? Does that
Oh,
make any?
I think you got it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
That's a lot better.
okay, good. Thank you for staying on that. Good. And for those who are happy not having to hear me, then we know who you are. Okay, so a couple of other things, big issues in the negotiation. One involves fishing in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. The Americans want access to the fishing grounds there. The British are reluctant to give them access to the fishing grounds there. This is a huge issue, consumes months of negotiations, and ultimately the United States does get the right, American fishermen do get the right to fish, okay? Which is good. And John Adams is actually the guy really pushing this because, of course, he's a New Englander and these are New England fishermen. And he says that he's not concerned with the squabbles of fishermen, but with conflicts of states. That is, he sees that if New Englanders don't have access to these fishing grounds, it's going to lead to problems between the British and the Americans constantly. And the other is what to do with the loyalists, the people who had remained loyal to the British crown and had lost. And I should tell you, the person most obstinate about not giving anything to the loyalists was Benjamin Franklin. And in London, the person who had emerged as the leader of the loyalists, pushing for compensation for the loyalists, was William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son. At one point, the British had proposed holding on to part of the Ohio River country as a territory to be a state for the loyalists. And Benjamin Franklin said, we don't want to have those neighbors. In fact, part of that country, the Vandalia country, was actually had been claimed by a private company, and both of the Franklins had invested in it. And Benjamin Franklin, as one of the owners of the Vandalia company, doesn't want to give up any of that to have loyalists like his son planted there. And when the British are pushing for compensation for the loyalists, Franklin prepares a memorial showing how much damage the British had done to Americans, burning Norfolk, Charlestown, Falmouth, New London, Fairfield, ravaging the countryside, scalping farmers. And he says, we'll put all of this against the claims of the loyalists. And if the loyalists actually suffered more, then we'll compensate. If it's in favor of us, then you'll compensate us. And he said, even if the British had conquered us, it would be very hard to force the Americans to compensate the Tories. And he says in this memorial, you will please recollect that you have not conquered us. So Benjamin Franklin is really obstinate about this. And when Franklin raises this whole issue of, scalping and burning of towns, the British fear that the Americans now are going to want the British to pay reparations. They say, okay, we're going to drop the whole loyalist thing. And meanwhile, in London, William Franklin is demanding to know how come they gave up so much land to the Americans. And, because he lost his claim to the Vandalia Company, and one of the negotiators, Mr. Oswald, tells him, well, Dr. Franklin drew a line on a map. And who am I to dispute Dr. Franklin? Now, William Franklin would have disputed Dr. Franklin since he knew him better. But anyway, so Franklin is doing this partially perhaps because of this relationship with his son. At the same time, John Jay's brother, okay, how the election works, Jillian wants to know. That's an interesting question. Okay. John Jay's brother, who is Sir James Jay, comes to France and he tells everyone, my brother was against independence and also he hates the French. Probably not a good thing to let the French know. Don't go to Vergennes and say it's a good thing you don't know how much he hates your guts if he's negotiating this treaty with you. John Jay really did hate the French, I should say that. He had been against independence too, but now he's certainly on the side of getting the treaty done. So between the 30th of October and the 4th of November, the Americans and the English negotiate pretty much around the clock. They're usually not in the same room. They're sending messages to each other about what they want and covering things like debt and so on. And the British really want to get this treaty done before the end of November when Parliament comes back into session. And on the 30th of November, they sign the preliminary treaty. And this happens to be St. Andrew's Day. And Franklin, by the way, as they're preparing to sign the treaty, gets out that blue suit he had bought a dozen years earlier to wear before the Privy Council when he had been humiliated by the Solicitor General. And so the Americans and the British signed this treaty, which is going to take effect after the French, the British, the Spanish, and the Dutch had settled. And so the English negotiators signed, the American negotiators signed, and one of the French guests said after the signing, they have a dinner. And one of the French guests tells one of the English negotiators that the 13 United States are going to form the greatest empire in the world, saying this as a way of taunting the English. So you had your opportunity to hold on to this continent, and now you've lost it. And now these 13 United States are going to form the greatest empire in the world. And the British negotiator says, yes, they will. And they will speak English, every one of them. Because I think there's a recognition on the part of the English that the Americans are going to be trading partners to Britain as opposed to France, no matter what the American temporary loyalty is to the French. And on the 5th of December, Parliament session opens with a speech by the King, and King George III opens Parliament with a speech announcing or acknowledging American independence. Now the peace, as I said, will take effect once the French and the Spanish have agreed to peace. But for the moment, what we see happening is the war winding down in America. Washington is not going to disband his army until the British have completely left. On the other hand, he really can't pay his army. So the war is continuing as the British are occupying New York and Charlestown, South Carolina, and Savannah. In December of 1782, the British evacuate Savannah, they evacuate Charleston, they bring all of their remaining troops to New York, and Washington has his headquarters in Newburgh, New York, which is up the Hudson River. So he has his army still there, as the British still are holding on to New York. And this is the end of 1782, early 1783. And you still have this chronic issue, not being able to pay the soldiers, not being able to pay the officers. And some of Washington's officers begin worrying about what's going to happen if we all go home and we haven't been paid, and Congress hasn't taken any steps to pay us. And in March of 1782, a Colonel Stewart comes back to camp from Philadelphia, where he had visited with Congress. And Stewart realizes Congress doesn't have any money. And right now, we can put pressure on Congress because we're all here. And we know Congress is a completely ineffective organization. Congress doesn't have the power to tax anyone. Congress can't raise a revenue. Congress really doesn't have any power. However, we do. That is, we are still the Continental Army, and we are the ones who have weapons. And can you think of a revolution which has been won by military force, in which the military hasn't played an essential role afterward? This is a huge problem here. In fact, sometime in the spring of 1783, Benjamin West was painting the king's portrait, and the king was really upset about the loss of America. And he says to West, "What do you suppose Washington is going to do now that he has won the war?" And Benjamin West says, "I imagine he's going to go back to his farm in Virginia." And the king says, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." That is, who would he? He has the only institution with any power in this new country. And is he simply going to walk away from that and let these mopes in Congress try to govern things? And the king says he will be the greatest man in the world. It's impossible that anyone would do that. And so we see Congress completely ineffective, the army the only real institution that has any force, and some officers are worried. What happens when we all go home? Will Congress really try to pay us, or will they say, okay, that's one problem we don't have to worry about? So actually, Colonel Stewart reports on the distress in Congress, and he talks about this with Horatio Gates, whom you may remember having played a role at Saratoga and at Camden, and being the guy that Congress had wanted to put up in place of Washington. And Gates says we should call a meeting with the officers and not have Washington come, because Washington has this real love for Congress, which we don't. So we'll have a meeting of the officers, and Gates circulates a statement saying that we want to tell Congress that although we were the first and would wish to be the last to encounter danger, and though despair itself could never drive us into dishonor, it might drive us from the field. The wound, often irritated and never healed, may at length become incurable. The slightest mark of indignity from Congress now must operate like the grave and part us forever. That in any political event, the army has its alternative. If peace, then nothing can separate us from you but death. If war, then counting the auspices and inviting the direction of your illustrious leader, you will retire to some unsettled country, smile in your turn, and mock when fear cometh on. So the army says, hey, we have an alternative. If there is war, we can decide what side we're going to be on, or we can simply abandon you altogether. Or if it's peace, then we'll get along with you. So Washington sees this as what it is. The officers in the army are thinking about what they can do to assert their power over Congress. Congress has absolutely no power. The army is the only institution with any real authority here. So in his general orders for the next day, Washington says he won't allow any disorderly proceedings. The officers cannot meet on the 10th of March, but instead he calls for a meeting on the 15th of March with representatives to decide what course to take. And he will not attend this meeting on the 15th. So the officers gather, they have a big tent. There's a raised platform with canvas over it. And this is where the officers met. Washington met some miles away in a stone farmhouse. The officers were living in huts that they had built or in tents here in the early spring of 1783. And Gates is presiding over the meeting. Henry Knox is seated at the table as the secretary. And as the meeting is about to begin, it's about noon, they hear a horse approaching. And into the tent comes General Washington. This is the first time during the entire war that Washington has entered a meeting not surrounded by his staff. Usually Washington has his aides with him. This time he comes in by himself. And he asks permission to address the meeting. And somewhat reluctantly, General Gates gives him permission to address the meeting. By the way, the Mass Historical Society has the speech that Washington gave. It's in his handwriting in very big letters, big clear letters. So this is the text that Washington read to the officers. And he is telling them they cannot exert their force over Congress. They are serving under the authority of Congress, and they would be betraying their cause if at this moment they tried to usurp authority. And it's a magnificent speech. And it concludes by saying, let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Look, these guys have just won this war against the British Empire. And now what they're doing is something that is going to lessen their dignity and sully their glory. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity and intentions of Congress. You will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. The great finish. Had this stage been wanting, that is what you do today, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. And Washington finished, and there was silence. He hadn't convinced them to put their faith in Congress. So what do you do now if you're Washington? You've just given them the speech of your life, told them what an example they could set to posterity, and they still are worried about how Congress is going to pay them. In fact, will they get half pay for life? Will they get full pay for 10 years? And these are the issues these guys really want to know, and they want to know where Congress is going to get the money to do either one. And he hasn't convinced them. He had that day gotten a letter from another member of Congress talking about what Congress was doing to help pay these officers. He pulls that out of his pocket and he starts trying to read it. Now remember, his speech was in very clear handwriting, big letters, and it's his own handwriting. Usually you can read your own handwriting more easily than someone else's. And Congressman Jones's handwriting was not very clear, and it was small. And Washington is holding it at different angles. And then he does something none of the officers ever imagined he would do. He reached into his pocket and he took out his glasses and he put them on. Before they were just silent. Now they're actually shocked because no one had ever seen Washington wearing glasses. No one knew that Washington wore glasses. And Washington realizes this. And he says, "You gentlemen must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service. And now I find I've also gone blind." Henry Knox immediately moves that the officers follow the lead of the commander-in-chief and let him negotiate with Congress. And by acclamation, the officers agree. What Washington has just done by putting on his glasses is save the country from a coup d'etat, from having the officers of the Continental Army, the only force that had any real authority in the country, from seizing power. And Washington does entreat Congress, and there's long negotiations about how to pay the officers. Meanwhile, there's another issue here involving soldiers, because in June of 1783, troops from Pennsylvania who were alarmed at the fact that the state of Pennsylvania hasn't paid them, and actually they are the Pennsylvania line of the Continental Army. And what has Congress done to pay the ordinary soldiers? I mean, Congress has been debating what to do about the officers, but now that Congress really hasn't done much thinking about what to do for the ordinary soldiers who have this same issue. So troops from Pennsylvania went down to Philadelphia. They didn't want to leave the army until Congress had figured out a way to pay them. And so they want to pressure Congress to do this. And they pressure Congress actually by surrounding the Independence Hall in Philadelphia where Congress meets. They're not going to let Congress leave until Congress has figured out a way to pay these soldiers. Congress meets in the same building, Independence Hall, where the Pennsylvania state government meets. And the congressmen are really upset having these soldiers surrounding Independence Hall. They call down the hall to the Pennsylvania legislature, asking them to call out the militia. That is, have the Pennsylvania militia come to the State House and drive these Continental troops out from around the State House. What would you do if you're the Pennsylvania legislature and Congress says, call out the militia to dispel the troops that are surrounding us and won't let us leave?
Say that is the militia?
Well, they're not the militia. These are the Continental troops. So Pennsylvania still does have a state militia who is called into action when there are, a lot of the militia had served, but these guys aren't the militia.
Wouldn't they just be trying to fight their own people almost? Like driving off their own, like people that are trying to help them?
Imagine that. Imagine having troops from Pennsylvania in the Continental Army fighting against militia soldiers from Pennsylvania in front of the State House. Now, what would this say about the possibility that the Americans will be able to govern themselves if you're having these two military forces fighting in front of the meeting place for the Continental Congress? the Pennsylvania Assembly decides we're not going to call out the militia to fight the Continental Army. And so Congress actually has to negotiate with the soldiers who agree, okay, we'll let you go, but we want you to keep working on this problem because we know where to find you. Congress is less upset, I think, with the soldiers who are trying to get what is due to them than they are with the Pennsylvania Assembly, which simply is hanging Congress out to dry. So last time, you remember, the British in 1777 had occupied Philadelphia, and Congress had gone to York, Pennsylvania. Congress is not going to meet anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania now after this tremendous snub from the Pennsylvania legislature. So they cross the river to New Jersey. They go to Princeton, and then they go to other places. John Armstrong, who is another soldier in the Army, writes to Horatio Gates, the great Sanhedrin of the nation, with all their solemnity and emptiness, have removed to Princeton and left a state where their wisdom has long been questioned, their virtue suspected, and their dignity a jest. People in Philadelphia knew what Congress was like, and they kind of made fun of them a lot. There's a lot of joking about Congress being completely powerless and ineffective. In fact, someone suggests when Congress goes first to Princeton, and then it makes its way down to Maryland, it goes to Baltimore, and then it goes to Annapolis. Someone suggests maybe we should put Congress up in a balloon. 1783 was a great year for the invention of the balloon. A couple of French brothers, the Montgolfier brothers, had developed a hot air balloon. And this is quite a craze. Benjamin Franklin goes to one of the first ascents of a balloon, and in the crowd, someone says to him, seeing this balloon go up, thousands of people gathered to watch the balloon ascend. And someone says, what good is it? And Franklin's response was, what good is a newborn baby?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just a little confused. So Congress is in a hot air balloon?
Someone suggests putting them in a hot air balloon. And they said they could float from one end of the continent to the other. And they could plop down wherever a state is not meeting its constitutional obligations and then go up again. It was a suggestion. What to do about Congress, put them in a hot air balloon. Members of Congress don't like having their dignity insulted like this. And so actually in 1785, what Congress does, they spend a lot of time planning to build a permanent capital. They don't want it to be under the subject to any state. And some of the delegates, primarily from New England and the eastern states, think it should be on the Delaware River because that's really convenient for us, but definitely not in Pennsylvania. So Lambertville, New Jersey looks like one likely site for a meeting place for Congress. Now, delegates from the southern states say, hey, you know what? The Potomac River would be a lot more convenient for us. And there's this vacant land near Georgetown in Maryland. That would be a good site for a capital. Congress is going to spend most of 1784 debating where to put their national capital. They're debating this as they're not in a hot air balloon. They're meeting in various rented quarters in Maryland. They can't agree, New Jersey or Maryland. So Congress decided to build both. They'll have two national capitals, and they can go back and forth between them. And this is at the same time, by the way, I mentioned the big problem Congress has is they don't have any money, and they don't have any way of getting money, but they're going to build two federal capitals. It says something about how ineffective Congress is. And just remember back in 1777, Congress had been driven out of Philadelphia by the British Army, and now in 1783, it's driven out of Philadelphia by the American Army. Now, meanwhile, as this is happening, on the 3rd of September of 1783, the final signing of the treaty happens, and news arrives in October. And the British now, Guy Carleton is the commander of the British forces in New York. They are preparing to evacuate New York, and Washington prepares to accompany Governor George Clinton to New York as the British evacuate. Washington is not going to end. By the way, first in New Jersey, he does say goodbye to most of his soldiers, sending them home. And then he is preparing to enter New York with Governor Clinton in late November as the British are evacuating south along Manhattan Island. Washington is not going to enter New York with his army. he's going to enter with Governor Clinton, because what he's showing is we are restoring the legitimate government of New York. With the British leaving, Governor Clinton can now again reestablish New York's authority in New York. And so Washington on the 20th of November left West Point, rode down to the Harlem River, and there on the 20th of November, he and Governor Clinton cross over King's Bridge into Manhattan. This is the first time Washington has been in New York since 1776, when the British had forced him and the American army out. The American pickets advanced south. The British also advanced south toward the Battery, and Washington and Governor Clinton rode into New York City. A woman who had lived in New York during the British occupation wrote in her diary that we had been accustomed for a long time to military display and all the finery and finish of garrison life. The troops just leaving were equipped as if for a show. With their scarlet uniforms and burnished arms, they made a brilliant display. Remember, this had been the headquarters of the British Army in North America, and the British Army was a very good army and very well equipped. The troops that marched in, on the contrary, were ill-clad and weather-beaten. They made a forlorn appearance, but then they were our troops. And as I looked at that and thought upon all they had done and suffered for us, my heart and my eyes were full, and I admired and gloried in them the more because they were weather-beaten and forlorn. New York then had, as the British boarded their boats and dropped down to Staten Island and then prepared to evacuate from Staten Island, the New Yorkers and Washington's army celebrated. And then on the 4th of November, Washington planned to begin his own journey home. That day at noon, he and his officers had a farewell lunch at Francis Tavern in the southern tip of Manhattan, a building that still stands and has a museum which commemorates this. Washington entered, his officers were standing around, there was a table set with glasses of rum. Washington picked one up, all of his officers picked up a glass, and Washington gave a toast. With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your later days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. And then he drank, and the officers drank. And Washington said, I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand. The first was Henry Knox. And Knox and Washington realized simply shaking hands would not be enough. Remember, Knox and Washington had first met in July of 1775, when Washington was inspecting the lines at Dorchester Neck, and he met Henry Knox, who had built a fort in Roxbury. And Knox and Washington had been constantly in service since July of 1775. In fact, at this moment, there are only 3 general officers in the Continental Army who had been in the service since the siege of Boston. One of them was Henry Knox, and one of them was Nathaniel Greene, who was absent because he was in South Carolina. Does anyone know who the third was?
Was it Gates?
No, it wasn't Gates, Sean. Gates had dropped out of the service at one point. It's Washington. Okay? This is one reason why, when the officers at Newburgh saw George Washington saying, I have grown blind in your service, they knew he had been there for 8 years. He had never left. He had given up more than they had in this. So Washington had that ability to command their respect the way Gates didn't, any other officer didn't. And now Henry Knox and Washington embrace. And one by one, Washington and the other officers embrace. And then he salutes them and he walks out. just accompanied by a couple of, actually David Humphreys and a couple of his servants. And they get on a barge that crosses the Hudson River over to New Jersey. And then he proceeds across New Jersey. And 4 days later, on the 8th of December, Washington reaches Philadelphia. And Washington's arrival in Philadelphia is met with church bells ringing, cannon firing. He spends a week in Philadelphia because even though Congress is not meeting there, this is still where the records are, and he's trying to settle his accounts. Remember, Washington had not taken a salary, but he had asked for his expenses to be covered. And so he wants to make sure his expenses are covered. And then he sets off for Baltimore and then for Annapolis. And on December 19th, Washington reaches Annapolis, where the Congress meets. On the 22nd of December, let me see if I can show you this. On the 22nd of December, Washington reaches the State House in Maryland, which I'm trying to show you. And the members of Congress tell him, come back tomorrow at noon, and we will hear any communications you wish to make to us. So at noon on the 23rd, Washington and two aides presented themselves to the Congress, which was meeting in the Maryland State House. Charles Thompson, the Secretary of Congress, and Thompson had been the Secretary of Congress in 1775, which is why his name is on the Declaration of Independence, escorted Washington into the room. George Mifflin, the President of the Congress and a sometime governor of Pennsylvania, was in the chair. 19 or so members of Congress sat around with their hats on. Again, this is a sign of respect or not respect, taking off your hat. What Congress is trying to show is that we're not going to take off our hat to you because you're actually serving under us. Washington comes in, he is shown to a seat facing Mifflin, and Mifflin tells him, "Sir, the United States in Congress assembled are prepared to receive your communication." Washington then rises from his chair, he bows, and at this time, the members of Congress take off their hats. And Washington says, "Mr. President, the great events on which my resignation depended, having at length taken place, I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country." He produces the commission that Congress had written out back in 1775, appointing Washington to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And now he returns the commission to the Congress. Happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty, and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation, I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence, a diffidence in my abilities to accomplish so arduous a task, which, however, was superseded by a confidence in the rectitude of our cause, the support of the supreme power of the Union, and the patronage of heaven. I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to his holy keeping. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. Mifflin received the commission, then replied. Actually, his reply was written by Thomas Jefferson, who happened to be in Annapolis at that moment. And then Washington and William Lee, his servant, rode out of Annapolis, and the next day, Christmas Eve, Washington returned home. He did what Benjamin West had predicted he would. He goes back to his farm. And in fact, his officers had decided they wanted to maintain the fraternal bonds which had connected them. So they created an organization, the Society of Cincinnati. Cincinnatus was a Roman farmer who's also a Roman military officer. His services were needed to save the Republic. So Cincinnatus left his farm, led the armies against Rome's enemy, and then at the end of the war, a grateful Rome offered Cincinnatus the dictatorship, and Cincinnatus declined, instead went back to his farm. And these officers and Washington were using that example. Someone who has the opportunity to hold on to power, but gives it up. And this is what Benjamin West had told the king, or the king had told Benjamin West would make Washington the greatest man in the world. So with that, the war ends. Independence has been achieved, but as I think I mentioned, the country has significant problems. Not the least is the debt. The debt owed to the soldiers, the debt owed to the French, the debt owed to Dutch bankers, the debt owed to American creditors. And no real way for Congress to raise a revenue. A couple of times Congress had proposed having a 5% impost, that is the ability to levy a 5% tax on imports. But in order for that to happen, every state had to agree. And Rhode Island wouldn't agree, New York wouldn't agree. That idea wasn't going anywhere. So we see in the 1780s as independence has been achieved, but the Congress has no way of paying its debts. In fact, in 1785, Congress had to default on the loan from the French. If you ever default on a loan, you know it's a very serious thing. No one's ever going to loan you money again. This is the same year Congress is planning to build 2 federal capitals, but it can't pay its debts. And it can't pay its debts because it doesn't have any power to raise a revenue from the states. Congress can requisition money, just as it requisitioned men from the states. That is telling the states, this is how much you should send in. And between 1781 and 1787, Congress had requisitioned something like $17 million from the states to meet its various obligations. And the states had problems of their own. That is, the states also had debts. And the states did have the power to tax, but of course states are reluctant to use that power because they're taxing the people who vote for the legislature. And so the states had sent in about $1.5 million, which isn't enough for Congress to pay its debts or to pay the soldiers or to do other things that Congress needed to do. And with Congress not meeting its obligations, the British are saying we don't need to meet our obligations under the treaty. The British hold on to the forts in the Ohio River Valley. The Congress also can't protect American trade. That is, the British had acknowledged American independence, but the British have no real reason to help the Americans become the greatest power in the world, as had been predicted at the Treaty of Paris. So in the summer of 1785, the Algerians, alerted by the British consul in Algiers that the Americans no longer are protected by the British treaty with Algiers. Algiers had a treaty with England. Every year England would pay Algiers about £1 million, and Algiers would not attack British merchant vessels. Instead, Algiers would attack French merchant vessels until the French pay Algiers 1 million livres every year to leave French vessels alone. And then Algiers would attack instead vessels from Russia or from Germany or from the Italian states or from Spain or from Portugal. And now in the summer of 1785, a new flag enters the Mediterranean and Algiers attacks it. So in the summer of 1785, two American ships are captured by Algiers and held for ransom. There's also a rumor circulating that Benjamin Franklin's ship bringing him home from England had been captured by Algiers. This is a rumor circulated by the English. Of course, if you are a merchant vessel and your vessel runs into the danger of being attacked somewhere, you might like to get insurance on it. and insurance rates for American vessels go up considerably in 1785. By the way, does anyone know where the world's maritime insurance industry was headquartered?
London?
It is London, yes. So the British are raising the cost of insurance for American vessels by having Algiers attack American vessels. Now, the Americans thus have a choice. If you sail into the Mediterranean to sell codfish, you have the possibility of being captured by Algiers. Why are the Americans going to the Mediterranean instead of to the West Indies? They're not going to the West Indies because the British are not allowing Americans to trade in Jamaica or Barbados. The French are also somewhat reluctant to let Americans trade in Martinique or Guadeloupe or Saint-Domingue, but the British have essentially closed the Mediterranean and the Caribbean to American trade. And what can the United States do about this? What could the United States do about Algiers? Algiers is capturing American ships. What would some options be in the best of all possible worlds?
Well, under the Articles of Confederation, they can't do much, right? Because Congress doesn't have authority to.
A, Congress doesn't have authority. B, Congress doesn't have money. I mean, one thing, one possibility would be to build a navy. Congress in 1785 had just sold the last ship from the American Navy from the Revolution. Navies are expensive things. So there's really nothing you can do there. Another thing is Algiers is demanding ransom. So you could pay a ransom and get these guys out. Thomas Jefferson is the American minister to France, and Jefferson thinks if Algiers captures an American ship and the Americans hurry to pay a ransom to Algiers, Algiers is going to capture more American ships because they see we're going to pay. So Jefferson says it's better just to ignore Algiers for the time being. We really should build a navy though, and we don't have any money. And the main reason we don't have a navy, two main reasons we don't have a navy. One, we don't have any money. B, navies are really expensive. And then there's a third reason. Virginians, and Jefferson is from Virginia, typically think building a navy would be a big waste of time. Plus, they fear a concentrated military force in the form of a navy. So you have these reasons the United States can't do anything about Algiers. Maybe it could pay ransom, but that would require raising money, and we can't raise money. So you have this big problem here. What to do about Algiers? Well, we really can't do anything, which means American merchants are better off staying out of the Mediterranean. This is a serious problem because something like 1/7 of American trade goes to the Mediterranean. And now you're saying, well, we're really can't go there because of Algiers. We can't go to the West Indies, which had been the main place we would trade because the British have shut us out. These are really serious problems. And it's unclear how exactly they could be solved. And Congress, as I said, is pretty ineffective at doing anything about it. So that, I think, is a good place to stop. Are there any questions? I see lots of people have been posting things in the chat feature. It's mainly about the audio. Jillian wants to know what happens, what can we expect in the election? And I have to tell you, I don't know. I hope that people vote, and I hope that people accept whatever the outcome is, which is what is the only way you can maintain a republic. And that, I think, is enough. You vote, and your state chooses electors based on who won the popular vote in the state. And then in mid-December, the electors will meet. They meet on the same day in every state capital, and they cast their votes. And then by that time, we should know who won the election. And it's not simply a popular vote. The Electoral College is there to make sure the states have a role in this, and it's not simply running up the popular vote in one place or another. And so you need to win a majority of the states as represented by the electoral votes. There are 538 electors, so you need 270 of them to be elected president. And then in the first week in January, Congress will assemble and both houses will meet and the vice president will count the electoral votes. And then we should know by that time. It's a period of uncertainty. What we all can do is realize that elections happen every 4 years. We always accept the outcome. And so that's my advice. I hope that you're happy with whomever you voted for, Jillian, and that we'll see how things go after this. So we may know more on Wednesday. And so it is very much, I mean, we see this in Washington's farewell, Washington's putting down a coup d'etat. We see the dangers are implicit here in any Republican form of government. The easier thing to do in a revolution is to throw out the bad guys. The much harder thing to do is to establish a system where you won't be governed by another set of bad guys. Typically, people who take power after a revolution, I'm not saying typically, often are worse than the people they replace. So just bear that in mind. And that's something, I think one of the real achievements of the American Revolution is creating a system in which that does not happen. How long will it take? I don't know, Julian. How long will it take to find out? I don't know. Let's be patient. And one of the reasons I enjoy teaching history is it allows me to forget about things happening today. And I'm not saying that it's simply a form of escapism, but it is. Other questions? Words of wisdom. See, I saw a headline the other day. I can't remember where, it's saying more young people are voting. We should listen to them. I'm not quite sure if listening to young. No, sorry. I realize I'm talking to young people. I'm not really sure listening to young people. I mean, you're paying me to talk to you, so. So are there other people I can insult or offend? Ainsley is contacting the dean right now, so that again. Well, I'll leave you all to it, and we'll reconvene on Wednesday and figuring out how the Americans get out of this situation without creating worse problems than they had left behind.
All I know is there is going to be some form of rioting, no matter who wins.
That's a really sad commentary.
I know.
I don't know how we got to this point. One day historians can look back and figure it out, how we reached this particular point. And you like what happened, you don't like what happened. I think the virus has a lot to do with people are bored.
I think it's like crazy thinking about like how we're learning history now, and like people who are going to be learning about 2020 are going to be like, what is going on?
Yeah, well, we'll see. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. You will find out. So, okay. Well, on that happy thought, I will let you all go and see you on Wednesday.
Goodbye, Professor.
The assignment that's like specific to just my situation, but I like I said, went on a wild goose chase, and then like most of the primary sources I ended up finding are housed by the state archive, not a local archive.
Mm-hmm.
So like, is that okay? I know that like I found them by looking, like emailing people from local archives.
Definitely.
Okay.
If you did you find them? Were you able to find things?
Yeah, kind of. I'm still working on like, I don't know. I guess Connecticut doesn't like require counties to record like information, like to maintain records. So like I emailed I'm talking about the Battle of Groton Heights and the burning of New London.
Okay.
I emailed the New London town clerk, the Groton town clerk, the Fort Griswold Museum, Fort Trumbull Museum, New London Historic Society, New London Landmark Commission. Like they all sent me different places. So yeah.
Well, I mean, this is good. I mean, finding out where you can find things is actually a pretty important thing. And so that's good. So, you may feel like, gee, I haven't found anything, or I haven't found enough, but actually this pursuit is sometimes as important, particularly at this stage. If you had, say, a deadline for a book, or you're getting a PhD, yeah, and you couldn't find it, that would be that. But I recognize for this purpose and finding out where the things are, I mean, that's a useful thing to do. So don't be discouraged. You're inside today instead of outside. Usually you're outside enjoying the great outdoors. So,
Yeah.
good. Well, good luck. Take care.